Tom, Audrey was talking there about your book, Poetry, Memory and the Party, which has given me infinite amounts of pleasure. Things that I didn't, names I'd forgotten, events that I didn't attend, but I sort of felt almost nostalgic for when I read about them in your book. But there are two figures in your book that are relevant here. One is the figure of Dervla Murphy, and the other is the figure of Molly Keane. They were both writers. They were both figures who seemed to emerge from nowhere to become sort of commanding figures in their area of travel writing and the novel. There's a shadow figure in your book, which is the idea that a young Tom McCarthy might have made his way to Bowen's court in a certain year, had time been different, had she been, had the house still been there, had Elizabeth Bowen still been alive. Can you give us a sense of what you would have found had you gone there, what she was like, what the house was like, and what her circumstances were?
Well, the thing about Elizabeth Bowen is that, in a way, the house was almost the only centre of her entire kind of psychology, in that for her almost her entire life she was adrift as a person, I think. And it was that kind of drifting 20th century feeling about her that gives her a continuous kind of modern feel. But I think if you arrived at Bowen's court, you would have found the gardener probably working hard and grumbling that he hadn't been paid well. You'd have found a very loyal housekeeper, cook, who, would have been trying to make ends meet on behalf of the Bowen family. Because I've never quite understood why she was so badly provided for. Because her father was a lawyer. He was a very important lawyer, Mr. Bowen. He was a senior counsel who specialised in conveyancing law. And he had actually helped a lot of the locals in North Cork, in collaboration with Canon Sheehan of Doneraile, to actually settle their title to their lands during the transfer of lands under the Wyndham Land Acts. So I'm always amazed at how ill provided she was. Now, of course, he became ill, and her mother died when she was young, so she was adrift. So I wouldn't have met a person that was like Molly Keane if I'd arrived at Bowen's court. I think I would have met a much more intellectual, secretive kind of person who didn't know an awful lot about the countryside, really, knew a little about flowers, knew a lot about flower arranging, couldn't probably name most of the trees on her estate, unlike Molly Keane. In a way, was a very urban person in an Anglo-Irish house, I think, which made her really interesting and modern. And it's one of the main reasons why she's really worth reading today.
Yeah. And of course, in that house, they lived in fear of water, because of course, water was the one thing that would destroy the house. So they didn't have, for example, hot water. No. So I love the story of Virginia Woolf coming to stay, and obviously being Virginia Woolf, she wanted to have a bath. But she had to go into the village, and a woman was paid to let Virginia. Can you imagine letting Virginia Woolf into your bathroom?
Yeah.
What would you like now? Soap, or so that that the house itself was stark and pure and probably damp and impossible to heat.
But beautifully proportioned.
Yeah.
A beautiful house. In fact, you could say the house, Bowen's Court, you could say that it was actually one of those Anglo-Irish houses that was never finished, really. That even the person who had built it in that generation, and Bowen herself talks about that in Bowen's Court, didn't really have the money left to kind of do the finer touches in the house itself. So it had its austere lines, a typical 18th century kind of block house.
It's really grotesque now, isn't it?
Oh, it is gone, you see.
But I mean, you can find bits of stones in a field.
Oh, you can, yeah. The remnants of it.
Yeah.
Actually, not even the remnants, just the memories of it, really, Do
you think there was a pride? I feel there was a pride in houses that weren't burned, that somehow they had been careful. In Wexford, it was considered that if you entertained the British Army in your house, you put your house at great risk. And that if you didn't do that, the locals would know you didn't do that because you'd let them know you didn't do that. Lady Gregory, for example, she wrote 3 articles about the outrages committed by the Black and Tans anonymously for the nation in England, and she let it be known locally that she'd written these.
Yeah.
But that she also let it be known locally she wouldn't have the British Army near her, that Tans were not coming to dinner.
Yeah.
So that her house was not burned.
Yeah.
Cool Park was not burned in the War of Independence, and of course, Bowen's Court wasn't either.
It wasn't, and I think it probably wasn't burned because of her father's reputation of helping the local farmers to get title to their lands, which is very important. I mean, if you think under the Wyndham Land Acts of 1903, I mean, it's really relevant now in County Tipperary, for example. 1.5 million acres or more even were transferred to Irish farming families. They got the title.
So the book, the last September, enacts a sort of nightmare. It enacts a sort of unconscious fear
her nightmare.
that the British Army, in the presence of Gerald, just for example, are coming too close, coming to the house too much, and somehow or other they've made themselves vulnerable. And the very thing that they must have feared most, she must have feared most, that the locals would turn on them.
Yeah.
That actually is what's dealt with in the book.
Definitely.
The book is her dream life, her nightmare life.
And in a sense, because of what happens towards the end of the novel, Lady Naylor is proved correct that Lesworth isn't a suitable person, for her niece, that he's trouble coming to the house so regularly. And Lady Naylor tells a lot of lies about him at the end, that, because she thought he was unsuitable for her niece Lois. But I mean, Molly, a lot of Anglo-Irish houses were also involved with the British Army because, of course, they were involved in the Army Remount Unit, which was a huge part of the British Army. If you think that by the 1917, the Army Remount Unit was responsible for 300,000 horses. They were so short of horses by the end of the First World War that they had to set up receiving stations in Texas and Kentucky to bring horses over to Ireland for kind of schooling and training and finishing. And also, the interesting thing about it is that the houses and the domains rather than estates, the estates nearly all went because, if you had estates of 25,000 or, in the case of the Dukes of Leinster, Earls of Kildare, 50,000 acres, all of those estates were transferred in ownership under the Wyndham Land Acts. But if you had a domain which was mainly woodland or a stud farm, it wasn't confiscated, even after the Land Commission was founded in 1923. So many of these, like Molly Keane's family, for example, kept going, training horses, schooling horses. But I mean, and indeed sometimes for the Army, even after independence, for the Army Remount units, which had 400 officers, many of them masters of foxhounds from Ireland.
Right.
So it was an incredibly social thing. And these farms and these families were so implicated in the life of the British Army that they were inevitably seen as legitimate targets,
Yeah, and we're talking about the book being published in 1929 and the book being set perhaps in 1921, 22.
Yeah.
The idea of those 8 years have, I think, two significance. One, that of course Elizabeth Bowen becomes a writer, in those 8 years.
Yeah.
She moves from being a girl like Lois, perhaps insecure, an only child,
and drifting,
and drifting to becoming quite a figure in the London of that time. But also, of course, in certain countries at certain moments, we think Ukraine at the moment, this decade will be a very long decade. So people would talk about the great difference between 2022 and 2028 in, for example, Ukraine. But think about Ireland, that looking back at that time, it is almost an historical novel in the way she's presenting these people, as though they're figures in history rather than contemporary characters.
Oh, and that is actually an Anglo-Irish trick, to present yourself as history rather than as living in the present moment. That's definitely one way of coping with a situation in your life and in your situation socially that isn't quite coherent. So you can continue on by being a past rather than who you are in reality. That's a very Anglo-Irish thing. It was definitely in the feelings of people I knew, like Molly Keane and people like that, that the past was so real that it continued. You know, life wasn't contemporary. Life was something in the past. But the 1920s were an important kind of moment of transition as well for women. In a sense, if you think of 1923, 24, there were other women like Vera Brittain, the wonderful Testament of Youth about the First World War, that great book. Winifred Holtby, Enderby Farm, she wrote that, and then South Riding. But all of those published their first books in 1923 and 24, which was interesting. Right. It was almost in the absence of men after the First World War, the women got a window to flower, and they did all through the 20s. Those who weren't dancing were writing.
I wonder if when Bowen was writing this book, she had two audiences in mind. One is an English audience, and the other were Frank O'Connor and Sean Whalon. In other words, that a sense of these two boys. I mean, I think it's fun that she has an old gardener called Donovan, you know, Frank O'Connor's real name, and that the rebels in the book are called the Connors.
Exactly.
And that this couldn't be. I mean, it must have been fun writing down their names, but that these two young writers who had come out of her own world, except, of course, from a completely different aspect of her own world, were now winning fame in London as young Irish rebels turned writers.
Yeah, yeah.
And that, you know, there are parts of the book where she wants to show that I found this really fascinating and dramatic, where she wants to show that, no, the Anglo-Irish were not English. Before they were anything, they were not English. So that she has Lady Naylor getting the very best lines, which in the film version are really wonderfully delivered by Maggie Smith. She said, of course, one cannot trace him. His mother, he said, lives in Surrey. And of course, you do know, don't you, what Surrey is? It says nothing, absolutely. Part of it is opposite. And he goes, practically no one who lives in Surrey ever seems to have been heard of. And if one does hear of them, they have never heard of anybody else who lives in, really altogether, I think all English people are very difficult to trace. Oh, I mean, she must have had such... I mean, the day writing this must have been a very bright day for her, because she realised she was Frank O'Connor and Sean Whalon, you know, the young Irish writers that she was interested in, were going to love this, because it was, you know, but also for herself to show, I might sound like an English woman, and I'm living in London, but I'm not. I'm not one of you. I know something you don't know. You know, Virginia Woolf may have, you know, great antecedents and, you know, great snobberies, but I come from a place that you will never understand, and I understand, which is Ireland. And I can have Lady Naylor talk like this.
Yeah.
I mean, there's an immense amount of fun in this book, isn't there, at the expense of England?
Well, there is a kind of knowing joking all the time going on at the expense of kind of innocent English bystanders, you know. And Lady Naylor is absolutely brilliant. I do think she has actually some of the best lines in the book. Even the lies she tells at the end about how she treated Gerald, you know, the young lieutenant. You know, she sort of said he loved coming here to the house, and we loved having him. It was such a shock. It's taken me a long time to get over the shock of his death. He was so, and she wrote to his mother, telling her how happy he had been at Danielstown, how happy he had been in Ireland. And
his mother writes back to say, yes, but didn't he die for a glorious cause? But Lady Naylor...
No, I wasn't going to buy into that.
She's not buying that for a moment.
No. Yeah. But also, I mean, there's like some of the uncanny things that Elizabeth Bowen does. One of the most uncanny things is the very long sequence towards the end of the novel when they arrange a gramophone dance in the barracks, which is obviously the barracks in Mitchelstown or Fermoy, you know, probably Mitchelstown. And the scene is written so intensely. It's like a madness, a kind of a late madness of a garrison that's not going to be there for very long more, you know. And that was what was so good, I think, about Elizabeth Bowen. You know, she could describe those situations of people who were placed where they shouldn't have been. Yeah. You know, whether they were orphans who had been farmed out to some relatives, or, you know, she was so good at that, and that must have come from her own personal life and feelings about her own situation, you know.
Yes, I suppose it's an interesting novel about history.
But it's amazing how hostile, in a way, she places Danielstown. It's not an idyllic place. It's constantly kind of brooding or an unwelcome presence in the landscape, you know.
Yeah.
So she transfers her own absence of political understanding of what's happening. I mean, one of the interesting things about both Bowen and indeed Edith Somerville and Molly Keane is how they misunderstand what's happening politically in terms of the revolution. There's always just a few people, a few revolutionaries like the O'Connors, or a few revolutionaries, as in kind of Molly Keane's novels like Mad Puppetstown, where Mad Puppetstown is, they come to burn Mad Puppetstown. That's a 1934 novel by Molly Keane. But they had no notion of just how big the Sinn Féin IRA organisation was. You know, if you think of my own hometown of Cappoquin, after, the great kind of Redmondite campaigns of 1915, nearly 200 men from the small town of Cappoquin joined the Allied forces to fight against the perfidious Hun. Only 20 joined Sinn Féin. So it was 10-1. And yet, Cappoquin was a small town, if you were to add Lismore, Tallow, Dungarvan, Ring, Old Parish, all of these places, it's suddenly like you're talking about maybe 300 active volunteers working in an area. So the Anglo-Irish, while they knew and they would have known some of the people involved, and there are a number of times, in fact, there are 5 or 6 incidents in the last September where both Lois and Lady Naylor are conscious of the servants listening. And so even when regimental notepaper, a letter is received in regimental notepaper, they hide that because that's information about where a regiment is placed, So they're conscious of that threat, but I don't think they have any idea about the overwhelming numbers that are against them.
You see, I think that's a brilliant point, because out of that lack, out of not knowing, she manages to produce the book. In other words, if she was locked into the November 1918 election, the victory of Sinn Féin, the various factions, how this was going to play out, she would have written a political novel.
She would.
And the novel would be so filled with the detail of things. And what she does instead is she looks at just how useless these people were in that last September, just how dreamy they were, and just how, for example, Lady Naylor and Sir whatever Naylor,
Sir Richard, yeah.
Thank you. They don't seem to ever have an actual conversation. They sort of pass one another by, both emotionally and topographically, as it were.
Yeah.
And of course, the couple who come to stay, the Montmorencys, don't seem to have anything at all in common. And then there's Lawrence, who's completely in a dream.
Yeah.
And then there's Lois. So they're all, and then there's Marder, who arrives from nowhere and goes back to nowhere and may be engaged and may be lesbian, in fact. And who knows? And that all of them are wandering, as it were, missing the point of each other all the time. The most substantial thing in the book, besides the trees and the house, are the portraits. So when they have the great dinner, and they're all sort of separated from each other, and no one quite knows what to say to each other, because Lady Naylor doesn't want to discuss what's actually going on in the world, because she probably knows more than the others, because she's downstairs with the servants. The portraits seem to loom so large looking over them, that substance, whereas the characters themselves are moving in a kind of shadow. But in that shadow, then, the figure of Lois emerges, as though she could be in another novel. She's in a way, she's in Bowen's novel, The Death of the Heart. That sort of young girl who's absolutely insecure, who doesn't know what she wants to be. She could become an artist. She could fall in love with anyone she meets. She could, like, marriage is a thing. She isn't quite sure what it is, but she'd like to have some of it.
Yeah.
And of course, with all these soldiers around, she's clearly going to fall for one of them, as of course in Jane Austen. The minute, the regiment arrived nearby, in Pride and Prejudice, someone is going to run off with the soldier. That's what you do with the soldier. You run off with him, and he's always unsuitable. And so that what she's doing is she's almost playing with the novel form. And I suppose the best version of that, or maybe the original version of it, is It's Stendhal's The Charterhouse of Parma, where Fabrice is deeply in love, and he's wandering around Europe on his horse, and he's just thinking about love. He could be a troubadour. He's just locked into love. But later on, he thinks that he did hear a lot of noise one day, and people going back and forth, and he may have been in Waterloo. And it may have been the right date for the Battle of Waterloo, and he may in fact have witnessed the Battle of Waterloo, but he didn't know it was called the Battle of Waterloo that day, and he was busy thinking about love. And it's the Stendhal saying, if you think I'm going to give you Tolstoy, if you think I'm going to give you the Battle of Waterloo, go away, because Fabrice being in love is what I want to write about. And so she's playing with that idea that Lois, and it isn't though Lois's emotions are strong, they're strong in that how vague and numinous and unnameable they are.
Yeah, she has almost no agency in her life. You know, Lady Naylor is constantly planning her future for her. She's the one who tells her that Gerald is unsuitable for her. In fact, so unsuitable that it shouldn't even be discussed or thought about, because he's absolutely nobody.
No money, no money.
Well, he's nobody, you see, which is a very important thing. But I mean, the whole idea that she's going to be maybe an artist because she has some talent in drawing, and then she's registered kind of, you're not really sure whether she did that or whether Lady Naylor arranged, it's all arranged for her anyway. But even then, like, even art is not immune from revolution, because as it Mrs. Veermont reminds people that these castes in the art school could be hiding arms, you know, for the IRA.
Yes.
And which is probably true, actually, in Cork anyway. But the thing is, it's this kind of circular insecurities about everything, even things that are physical. You know, even the dynamic feelings about the portraits, for example, you know, that the portraits are almost living things, and that they lean into the kind of dining table. They almost become part of the consumption of thought at the dining table. Like these, and the house is a living thing in Elizabeth Bowen, very much so. Like the house has these appearances which are kind of sentient, which are thinking appearances, as if the stones were kind of thinking about what was happening. And families go from generation to, Anglo-Irish families go from generation to generation being worthy of the house, if you like. That they are kind of a disappointment to the house or a disappointment to the estate. But, you know, it's almost no different from the Trump family, you know, and Mar-a-Lago in Florida, you know, like, are they worthy of that place? You know, can you live up to that place? Like, it's always, in the end, it is nearly always about the family's interests. Their physical, their financial and physical interests, and their standing in society.
But it is true in this case, isn't it, that because this is an Irish novel, it has a Gothic edge to it. In other words, these characters are slightly doomed. They're sort of playing out a game in which death plays a very large part. In other words, that Lois looks, every time everyone sees her, when the Montmorencys come say, Laura, look, she's like Laura. They think she is Laura, and her dead mother really looms large in everyone else's version of her. And it's significant the Montmorencys have no children and the Naylors have no children, that somehow that this is the end of their world. And we're going to watch it burn, but before it burns, we're going to watch its doom. We're going to watch it sort of slowly everyone realizing somehow that the ancestors' power over them is almost complete now, and that there won't be a next generation, that Lawrence will go off to Oxford, that Lois will go anywhere she wants, but the house itself, even before it burns, is sort of dead. And all the characters are operating in a sort of death in life in the way they move, in the way, for example, I mean, tiny details. I couldn't get away with it if I tried it, to have two bookcases that are locked and no one can find the key. And if you put that in a novel, I say, no, really, come then, get that out of your novel, because, like, but you believe this here. This house is sort of, it's coming to an end.
The key is important in the kitchen garden as well, in that the key, the kitchen garden, because of course it has valuable fruit and all these kind of things that the ordinary peasantry might need. It's always locked.
Yes,
locking the garden.
There's a moment when...
Yes, and Livy Thompson, she wants to bring Livy Thompson, Livy Thompson, like, is the most hilarious character in the book, in that she's one of those people, you know, who's never welcome in the house, really. That, like, that they're a complete nuisance when they turn up, and they hang on hoping they'll be asked to stay for lunch. And like they ask for inappropriate things, they say ridiculous things. I mean, like she's just an annoying, like she's one of the annoying people and simply annoying, Livy Thompson. But then she becomes interesting because she has this meeting in the Imperial Hotel.
Which is pretty well done, isn't it?
Brilliantly done.
Yeah, and everyone sees it.
Yeah, and she thinks she's having this secret meeting with her. But it is interesting. But I mean, she, a bit like Marda, like thinks of engagement as a second chance in a way. You know, a romance is saying that, well, as Marda sort of, and Elizabeth Bowen writes, Marda was thinking of the engagement ring is a passport at any frontier. And I was sort of like, it was an offer of a new life.
Yeah.
You know.
But Bowen won't go as far as giving them a marriage. You know, it's the engagement will be the thing. Now, we need to talk urgently, really, before we go any further about the style. Because before this is anything else, it's a novel written in style. It draws attention to itself constantly.
Absolutely.
I mean, semicolons, Tom. Let's talk about them. I mean, just take this. This is page. This is really just what is it? It's just very early on. They swept in. Well, all of us could write that. I mean, that's what they did. They arrived in the car and then they swept in. They swept in, semicolon. Their exclamations constricted suddenly, filling the hall. So obviously from outside, they're sort of loud, constricted suddenly. There was so much to say after 12 years. Another colon this time. They all seemed powerless. And she does this a lot where you think the next sentence is going to be a completion of the last one. And instead it darts off somewhere. I mean, as though the wind changes suddenly. I mean, there was so much to say after 12 years. Well, you go to the next sentence, Lady Niella could not stop talking, or they didn't know where to begin. No, they all seemed powerless. Then Lois hesitated, went in after them as nobody noticed, came out again. The car with the luggage, and it goes on. Now, the house, we're going to watch the house. She yawned and looked out over the sweep to the lawn beyond, where little tufts of shadow pricked like reeds from water out of the flat gold light. Wow, that's a pretty complex vision, isn't it? Listen to it again, where little tufts of shadow, this is the lawn, pricked like reeds from water out of the flat gold light. Beyond the sunk fence, 6 Kerry cows followed each other across with wading steps and stood under a lime tree. All the way up to the house, the windows were open. Light came diagonally from window to window through corner rooms. This whole idea of the architecture. And then 2 stories up, she could have heard a curtain rustle, but the mansion piled itself up in silence over the Montmorency's voices, as though the house itself is not just a living thing, it's a throbbing thing, it's an active thing.
Yeah. Very like Bowen's Court, how she feels about Bowen's Court. But I mean, one of the extraordinary things about, and I suppose it is in E.M. Foster as well, is the way she can describe physical detail. You know, I mean, even when Mrs. Veermont comes into a room and she talks about Mrs. Veermont sitting in a wicker chair, and she says the wicker chair discussed her briefly before settling.
Yes.
And that's exactly what a wicker chair would sound like.
Yes.
But that's what she does.
The distant ceiling imposed on consciousness its blank white oblong. That's pretty good. Meaning there was a ceiling. It was white. It was oblong, and it did affect you in the room. But it imposed on consciousness its blank white oblong. I mean, that's pretty good. You could put it in a poem. It's blank white oblong would be a lovely
fine line,
stanza, wouldn't
fine
it?
half line anyway of a poem.
And a pellucid silence distilled from 150 years of conversation. It's as though the dead are not dead. It's as though the dead are hanging around. Bits of what they said before are being heard. Into this silence, voices went up in stately attenuation. Now, the only person who's getting away with this in this year is Virginia Woolf. This idea of voices going up in stately attenuation. And then, and then now there were no voices. Mrs. Montmorency and Lawrence sat looking away from each other. And Woolf can do that too, where she can have an extraordinary sentence filled with strange words and then go into a plain descriptive. Mrs. Montmorency and Lawrence sat looking away from one another. So that as well as being an Anglo-Irish novelist in London, she's also and being acutely alert to Frank O'Connor and Sean Whelan. She had an affair with Sean Whelan. In fact, she was in bed with Sean Whelan when the Second World War broke out. Her husband called up from the Foreign Office and she was in bed with Sean Whelan. But that's just an aside. She's acutely conscious of her own difference from English people. But yet, there must have been an extraordinary connection. Well, when she read Virginia Woolf, she
Well,
must
the
have been
texture
really
is
paying attention.
high Mandarin prose.
High Mandarin prose.
Which is of kind of that world, of Ian Foster and Virginia Woolf.
But there is something else there, isn't there? Though it's in Catherine Mansfield and it's in Woolf and
that
it's
is
in her,
true.
of describing picnics, tennis parties, people coming in and out of rooms, and all the time as though the air itself is alive. That it's not just the person wearing colour, the air itself.
It's a young world. It's interesting like that. It is the remembered world of people who were very young. We tend to forget that like she was quite young. She was a young novelist. She wasn't a sort of recollecting in the maturity of her 80s or something like that, like an elderly Anglo-Irish novelist. But she was a young person. So she was also young and excited enough about the texture of prose. And I think that is one of the incredible things about her. It's the texture of her prose writing that is so interesting. You could say, okay, maybe it's a bit self-indulgent, all those colons and semicolons, but she's trying to create an enchantment or an enchanting effect, so that the reading of prose as an experience becomes something physical, which is a very adolescent, young kind of feeling about words and language. So it's true what you said earlier, that she's almost a poet, but not writing poetry. She's not interested in that. She's too interested in character to be writing poetry. It's characters and how characters lie to each other or remain in the world unformed. That's what's important to her, are never quite cohering. That's like it's all over the novel. Like she an emotional kind of straying, as she says, was what Lois had. An emotional kind of straying. But the landscape and the war itself and Ireland was also straying emotionally at that point as well. So you have like page 176 there in the novel. I don't know if it's 176 in yours, towards the end.
Yeah.
Where is we here now? Yeah. She would have been surprised to have seen him. This is Gerald.
Yes.
At the same time, at this same moment, step across to the island and stand there rootedly. And his whereabouts, even so much as guessed at, would have been quite at her mercy. For to have followed the stream to this loneliest reach, beyond the plantation wall, where the meadow's hedge trailed unknown blackberries over the water, was not to have walked, to have strolled even, but to have betrayed oneself in an emotional kind of straying. So the estate and domain is holding them together psychologically.
Now, what are we going to do about this? That the way that she even gets Mr. Connors to speak is just slightly, her ear is slightly off for Irish speech.
It is, yeah.
And the
But it's what she's hearing.
And the number of servants who are mentioned in passing, we realise they're gardeners. They're actual gardeners. There's a cook. There's a servant who always seems to, the number of servants who are barely mentioned, the fact that the Connorses are there, Mrs. Connors is in bed, Mr. Connors is wandering around, the son is on the run, the son's wife is mentioned, but the Anglo-Irish are given an extraordinary amount of, in a way, dense textured description of prose, their motives, their clothes, their relationship to history, their relationship to the future, even as what the young people might do. That there is an argument to be made, isn't there, that this is an extraordinary novel about a privileged class in their last September, and that the other class, the underclass, are barely imagined, but they're about to take over, and that she may or may not be fully aware of what she's doing in her own book.
Yeah, although I must say she is accurately describing Anglo-Irish life, in that the servants are meant to be invisible. They should have most of their work, like laying new fires, cleaning all the major furniture, done before the Anglo-Irish, after they've read the daily letters, which have just arrived, say, after breakfast, and read the Morning Post or the Irish Times. By the time the aristocratic family or Anglo-Irish family are wandering the house, most of the servants should definitely be gone. And if they are moving about the house, say from floor to floor, they're using the back stairs, which is the service stairs. They'll only see them if they come in or out through the baize doors that always separated the back stairs from the front
Yeah,
stairs.
this
So
is- but
they had a separate life.
Yeah, but this would be true in an English novel too. It's in Nancy Mitford. It's in all those books. But the difference here is that this crowd is about to take over. That you don't. The cook is clearly, everyone knows the Connors, and so there's a funny moment when this idea of divided loyalty, when Connors is finally caught, and everyone thinks this should be a wonderful occasion for celebration.
Richard Naylor is furious.
Is really because they're his neighbours
Disaster.
and because he lives in proximity to them.
Yeah, and he knows that will cause tension, which has never been there before, between the Connors and the estate. And I mean, he also is aware, he is aware, as Lois is, that Connor's mother is dying, which is an important thing too. And he shows sympathy for her, and he inquires, as Lois does, after her health. But it's interesting that Sir Richard seems to have the most kind of relationship with the people of the neighbourhood, knows most about them, and for that reason, he's the very person who doesn't want to know any more.
Yes.
He knows enough, doesn't want to know specifics about them, because he might have, as a loyal person, he might have to report those specifics.
Yeah.
Whether he has just left home. 3 of the families who were tenants have left, 3 of the men from those families have left home. Well, that's obviously an indication that there's an IRA manoeuvre being planned.
Yes. Yes.
So that's military information.
Now, it must have been tempting, or was it, for her to write a brutal IRA sequence, a scene where they really come in and kick things round, the IRA people.
Yeah.
I mean, we get that happening with the British. We don't see it as a scene, but we hear about it. In other words, they come into almost to the dance to say, oh, we're being told now to go to houses where there are women and check the beds and, so that's what they're doing.
Well, remember when Lois, I mean, it is interesting, their relationship with the military, in that the Anglo-Irish, or certainly the Naylors of Danielstown, they didn't really, while they were loyal and respected, obviously, the military tradition and that, they didn't really like, in particular, the activities of the Black and Tans. In fact, they were quite afraid of the Black and Tans. There's one great scene where, is it Marda and Lois they hear a lorry full of Black and Tans in the distance, and they actually drive down or up a side road to avoid them.
Yeah.
And I love what Lois is thinking like that. And they're hoping that they won't be noticed by the Black and Tans, because if the Black and Tans noticed one hiding, they could be very sarcastic. Which I thought was brilliant,
Yeah.
They would shoot you if you were Irish, but they'd be sarcastic if you were Anglo-Irish.
I was interested in the same way as the locked bookcases seem to me to mean something. You often in a novel, you could just put in a single detail, and that's enough to suggest a whole thing. No one is able to get to those books. People are not reading them.
Not at all.
And something, But the other one that I think is significant is when an IRA man comes and he takes a pair of shoes and a watch, he sends back the watch. In other words, these people don't steal. It's a tiny detail, but it suggests a great deal. And it's Sir Richard's response. This is an insurgency. But it's somehow...
And the watch was working perfectly.
Yeah, and the watch...
And Sir Richard says, that tells you something.
Yes.
Which is to say what it tells you.
Yeah.
But he didn't damage the watch.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was cared for.
Yeah.
By
and
the
in
IRA.
a way, that's her tribute to the Ireland that emerged soon afterwards.
Yeah.
And that she's writing all these years later. Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you very much for coming, everybody. Thank you.